Hi, welcome or welcome back to Books and Bocadillos. My name is Mariandrea, and this is Saturday catch up. I am in the middle of doing chores, which is why I am dressed in just this kind of gear. And um, I'm taking a break from my chores to come and try to catch up on the booktube videos that I had planned for this week. I missed Thursday night poetry, and then I tried to recreate it last night on Friday night, and that was a huge fail. My audio was warped. So here we are, Saturday afternoon, and I am going to try to bring you what I had planned for Thursday night poetry, and that was my beloved Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. In translation, translated by the translator, the wonderful translator, Edith Grossman. So, with my Thursday night poetry videos, I've been trying to focus on the poetry by women in translation and also highlight some really great translators. I can vouch for these translators because I oftentimes will, be curious and read both languages, English and Spanish. And last last week I talked about the poems of Liliana Valenzuela, who's one of my favorite contemporary poets. But more than her poetry, I'm just amazed by her translation. And Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz is a historical icon. She is a criolla. She's Mexican. From her parents were colonizers, were immigrants from Spain, and so they settled in New Spain, which is now Mexico. So Juana Inés de la Cruz is known for her feminism. At the time, maybe there was not that label of a feminist, but she ruffled feathers, and in the end, she was silenced, and she died young. She died in her 40s, I think, at the age of 46, and she became a nun because she didn't want to get married, and she knew that the the protocols, social norms at the time would be that she would marry, and she was of marrying age and getting older and avoiding marriage, and decided she wanted to devote herself to study, and she became a nun, and she carved out a space for herself as a scholar, and did a lot of writing and a lot of social criticism. So she criticized the Catholic Church, she criticized the patriarchy, and she became very well known for her time. I learned about Sor Juana Inés as a child, and she's on the Mexican currency, and then as a Mexican immigrant in the United States, I was able to um, really, really become more acquainted with her literary work through my high school Spanish class. I had an amazing Spanish teacher in high school, and she taught us a lot about the classic Mexican literature, Latin American literature, really. But I I feel like I really learned a lot about Mexican history through literature. And that was really amazing, an amazing experience for me. So Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz has been in um, my historical, social awareness, my admiration for most, if not all, of my life. Um, I went to Catholic school as a child. I was taught by nuns. I have just deep admiration for some of the nuns that I've encountered in my lifetime, and I'm captivated by that quiet life of service, and I'm just really interested in continuing to learn more about Sor Juana, about her life, and I don't know everything by any means. I'm just kind of giving you the quick rundown of like what I know about Sor Juana, but I'm always interested in learning more and more. So today I want to talk about this collection of selected works, edit not edited, translated by Edith Grossman. this particular copy has an introduction by Julia Alvarez, and I want to share a little bit about it because Julia Alvarez is also one of my favorite contemporary Latin American writers. She is Dominican, and she's a Dominican immigrant living in the United States. And she writes a lot about the cultural nuances that transplants like me and like Julia face as we leave our countries of origin to come in search of the American dream and the challenges that we face when we do that. So a lot of her literature talks about or acknowledges some of those nuances, some of those challenges, and I can identify with a lot of um, the conversations that come about through her literature, through Julia Alvarez's literature. So because I love her work, I'm also interested in just sharing a little bit about how the intro introduces Sor Juana. This is from the introduction by Julia Alvarez. When I was a girl and I would speak out of turn, especially in my own defense or in defense of some supposedly indefensible person or idea, my mother would caution me, No te pongas tú de Sor Juana. Don't you try to be a Sor Juana. I had no idea who Sor Juana was, and when questioned, my mother, who was not a reader, had little to say about Sor Juana's writings, but Mommy knew the outlines of this famous nun's story, a female who also couldn't hold her tongue and came to a bad end. Sor Juana entered that very small pantheon of personal saints I didn't yet know I was accumulating, seedbed for what was to come. Joan of Arc, Scheherazade of the Arabian Nights, the intrepid star-chasing Princesita Margarita of Rubén Darío's poem. But unlike these others who were in my prayer book or in storybooks or in poems I was taught to recite, Sor Juana was nowhere except my mother's admonitions. I assumed she, too, had been burned at a stake or beheaded because that was the only bad end I could imagine when I was told that she had been silenced. I was not yet a reader, still living in Spanish, years and another country and language away from becoming a writer, so I had not yet discovered that being silenced is a kind of death. Interestingly, my initial encounter with this first great poet of the Americas and brilliant intellect of Spanish letters, known by her own contemporaries as the 10th Muse, was a kind of boogie woman, marched out to teach me the risks of having a mind of my own. Sor Juana's example was usually accompanied by the popular refrain or saying, El clavo que sobresale siempre recibe un martillazo. The nail that sticks out always gets hit by a hammer. We were living in a dictatorship where being outspoken could bring you, male or female, certain imprisonment and a likely tortured death. So my mother had every reason to fear a child who liked to tell stories and argue against authority. Years later, having escaped the dictatorship already at home in the United States and in what had become my dominant language, English, I learned more about this iconic figure, Sor Juana, who was one of a number of gifted women who had suffered hardship and censorship for their talents. In those heady days of my apprenticeship as a young poet in the early 1970s, emboldened by the feminist movement, I claimed her as one of my influences. But again, it was her biography, not her writings, which dominated my imagination. And of course, she held a special place in my iconography of models because among my many literary godmothers, Emily Dickinson, Jane Austen, George Eliot, Virginia Woolf, among others, Sor Juana was the only one who came from my part of the world. Empty of substance as my claim was, I had yet to read a word she had written. I was fiercely proud of her, unlike the imagined Judith Shakespeare of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, who never went to London or wrote her plays and sonnets. Sor Juana managed to get herself to Mexico City, be invited into the viceroyal court, pursue her studies, and write works celebrated throughout the Spanish-speaking empire. A big part of the world back then, she was definitely not one of the many Teresas George Eliot describes in her Prelude to Middlemarch, who, because of meanness of opportunity, sank unwept into oblivion, a cygnet reared uneasily among the ducklings, who never found the living stream in fellowship. Here was the astonishing case of a poor, illegitimate colonial female to boot, who turned around the meanness of her situation and became the literary star of her time. But then, oh boy, was Mommy ever right again! Sor Juana had come to a bad end, eventually falling out of favor, unprotected, pressured to sell her books, stop writing, confess and renounce her sinful life, signing her self-condemnation with her own blood. 2 years later, she was dead at 46 after ministering to her fellow sisters in the convent stricken by the plague. So this was what happened to women who followed a calling and attained a voice. Sor Juana's story both thrilled me and terrified me. But this telenovela of her life was really all I knew of Sor Juana, a case of putting the biographical cart before the Pegasus of her poetry. Like the life story of another of my muses, Emily Dickinson, one whose poems I had read, Sor Juana's biography can be so intriguing that her work can become eclipsed by it. Interestingly, Sor Juana's fate went in an opposite trajectory from Emily Dickinson's, who became famous and known after her death, one of the luminaries of the English-speaking literary canon. Sor Juana, on the other hand, enjoyed wide acclaim during her lifetime in the second half of the 17th century in the Viceroyalty of New Spain, as well as in Spain, where her work was first published. But then for nearly 200 years after her death, she and her works were forgotten, until the Spanish-speaking world began to rediscover her in the early 20th century. But among the monolingual English readers, her work was little known. In the early 1980s, inspired by the growing feminist movement, a few translations appeared in anthologies of women's writing. Octavio Paz's masterly biography Sor Juana, or The Traps of Faith, published in 1982 in Spanish and an English translation in 1988, did much to champion this universal writer and complicate and contextualize the work and the life. I really want to read this book by Octavio Paz. Side note. Then came the movie in 1990, Yo, la peor de todas, I, the worst of them all. The phrase that Sor Juana used to describe herself in her profession of self-condemnation. Still a case of the biography eclipsing the work, in my ignorance, I too was contributing to the forgotten fate of her writings. But I was caught in the dilemma of many first-generation immigrants who remain identified with their origin culture but are not fluent in their native language. Culturally Latina, I had become English dominant, which in the sometimes charged identity politics of the 1980s and 90s felt like a betrayal of what should have been my mother tongue. Like Sor Juana, I and many Latina writers had a number of conflicting identities to negotiate. Our Hispanic roots, Hispanic itself became a contested term. With our independent Americanized lifestyles, our feminism, with our feeling of loyalty toward a cultural inheritance, with problematic patriarchal and machista aspects, our English language, which implied assimilation and brought us a mainstream readership, with our Spanglish insertions and Latino characters and content, which set us apart and bound us to our often regional comunidades. And unlike many of my fellow Latinas who had been here in the USA forever, I had been raised in the Dominican Republic for the first 10 years, so I had no excuse for not continuing to study my childhood Spanish. It was my secret I was too embarrassed to reveal. I wanted to claim Sor Juana as one of my influences, but since I do not read easily in Spanish, and especially the Spanish of the 17th century Baroque period, I was hostage to whatever samplings of her work made their way into English translation. But just as Sor Juana found her viceroys to gift her with books and intellectual resources and fellowship, I too found mine. Much of my knowledge of Spanish language writers has come via English translations, and none more than those of Edith Grossman, who has given me, as well as countless others, access to those texts. Works as varied as Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera and News of a Kidnapping, Mario Vargas Llosa's The Feast of the Goat, about the very dictatorship I grew up in, and the novels of a favorite contemporary Cuban writer, Mayra Montero. What I've always admired about Edith Grossman's translations is the ease and elegance, their clarity and accessibility. one has the sense of hearing the original without the interference of a costumed style, trying too hard to recreate the voice and instead betraying the effort of the impersonation. Toward the end of his life, Stanley Kunitz remarked that he wanted to write poems that are natural, luminous, deep, spare. I dream of an art so transparent that you can look through it and see the world, hard enough to achieve in one's own language and near impossible in translation. This is Edith Grossman's art. We feel we are in touch with the original text. It might be why a story that may be apocryphal, Gabriel Garcia Marquez supposedly claimed that he preferred reading his own novels in her, as well as Gregory Rabasa's English translation. And I concur. I have read a lot of the poems in this collection, and I don't feel like they're lacking in any way. I feel like Edith Grossman has given them kind of this new life. And I think that's the wonderful thing about why we celebrate women in translation, is because it creates accessibility. And there's no, Julia Alvarez talks about the shame of being a person who should know the language, should, in quotations, know the language that of the original text, but you don't, or you don't know it fluently, and so it becomes more of a task or chore or challenge to access the context and the language, especially, like she said, of a Baroque period. So yeah, I just am thinking about just the authentic voice and the vulnerability that Julia Alvarez shares in her introduction to both Sor Juana and to the translator Edith Grossman. Now, moving on to the translator, Edith Grossman has a translator's note at the beginning, and I also just read it and loved it so much. This is what a little bit about the note, the translator's note, by Edith Grossman. Why bring out another translation of works by Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, born in 1651, died in 1695? Perhaps the most legitimate and straightforward answer to the question is this: why not? Works of literary art don't appear to age. Generations of readers pore over them, embrace them, and make them part of their lives, but paradoxically, translations of those same works can become time-worn. Some commentators claim that the maximum shelf life of a translation is 30 years. I won't argue for or against the number. It's not an issue I've looked into with any care, but the fact that translations do age seems indisputable. Just consider the surprising number of versions in English of great works of literature by Homer, Dante, Cervantes, Goethe, Baudelaire, Chekhov, or Neruda. What other than the sense that a new translation is needed for contemporary readers could possibly send translators and their publishers back over and over again to the same literary wells? Agreeing to undertake any literary translation can often seem the height of temerity, an act of hubris doomed to calamitous failure. After all, for years, translators have been admonished with devastating frequency that the endeavor is impossible, that we have embarked on a fool's errand, that our work invariably betrays the original. Even so, we persevere. This new translation exemplifies the tenacity of our resolve. It's brilliant. Sor Juana is a profoundly enigmatic author whose position as indispensable writer has not been challenged in our time, and whose compositions have already been brought over into English by some of our most accomplished translators. And this leads us to pose the question again: why a new edition of her work? Which brings up a related question that loomed very large as I worked on this book. Does the translation of her work present particular sui generis problems? Called the 10th Muse by her contemporaries, a name that still resonates, Sor Juana continues to perplex us. Unlike Luis de Góngora and Francisco de Quevedo, two of the great poets of the Spanish Baroque, who inspired her, she was largely self-taught. Far from being a provincial autodidact, however, she had a prodigious intellect, a vast store of scriptural, theological, classical, and contemporary knowledge, immense skill as a writer in a broad range of genres, and a real penchant for study and scholarship, with a special proclivity for the sciences and music. She was a nun, but not a cloistered one, and regularly held an elite salon in the convent's locutory, was the largest private library in the Viceroyalty of New Spain, later Mexico. Yet, in spite of all her acumen, learning, and astute intelligence, she somehow failed to take into account the depth of sexist bigotry that prevailed in every sector of society, including the church, to which she had devoted her life. Why did she allow herself to be caught in the snares set by a misogynistic hierarchy embodied in the person of Manuel Fernandez de Santa Cruz, Bishop of Puebla, who once had been her friend and associate, but who attacked her in a portentous letter, purportedly by another nun, the fictional Sor Filotea, after he had asked her to write a theological challenge to a male cleric and then publish it without her permission. Her proto-feminist response to Sor Filotea, an impassioned and erudite defense of a woman's right to study, develop her mind, and commit her thoughts to paper, did nothing to dissuade the church authorities from punishing what they saw as intolerable arrogance and undue independence of thought. She was obliged to disperse her library, stop writing, and submit to the discipline of harsh physical and spiritual chastisement. She had crossed a line into forbidden territory and could not be permitted to emerge from that trespass unscathed. In this groundbreaking book on Sor Juana, Octavio Paz offers an intriguing interpretation of the impact of this all-encompassing repression of her writing. Octavio Paz writes, in addition to the anonymous community of ordinary readers, there is a group of privileged readers called the Archbishop, the Inquisitor. They had as much influence on Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz as her admirers. Her dread readers are a part and a significant part of her work. Her work tells us something, but to understand that something, we must realize that it is utterance surrounded by silence, the silence of the things that cannot be said. The things she cannot say are determined by the invisible presence of her dread readers. When we read Sor Juana, we must recognize the silence surrounding her words. The silence is not absence of meaning. On the contrary, what cannot be said is anything that touches not only on the orthodoxy of the Catholic Church, but also on the ideas, interests, and passions of its princes and its orders. Sor Juana's words are written in the presence of a prohibition. That prohibition is embodied in an orthodoxy supported by a bureaucracy of prelates and judges. An understanding of Sor Juana's work must include an understanding of the prohibitions of her work confronts. Her speech leads us to what cannot be said. Edith Grossman responds, the baffling challenge to the translator of her writing is how to reproduce the silence of the things that cannot be said in another language. This isn't a Zen conundrum, not the sound of silence or one of hand clapping. On the contrary, this is the terrified silence created by fear of the Holy Office, the constant intimidating presence of the Inquisition. What precisely we must ask, did Sor Juana not say in order to conform to the strictures of an oppressive society and of what she always referred to as her status or her state, that is, her position as a member of a religious order? The question must be asked, but the answer is not easy to find. The issue of that silence may well be one of the factors that continue to draw both translators and readers to her writing. The ongoing effort to decipher words not spoken penetrates to the enigmatic core of her life and work. And then she goes on to talk about the second part of the conundrum or the challenge of translating Sor Juana's work. She says, I like to mention very briefly some of the choices I made as I developed the voice of this translation. My usual practice in translating poetry is to focus on rhythm and meter, and give much shorter shrift to rhyme, not because it lacks importance. Rhyme is actually an integral part of a poem's rhythmic structure, but because for me it is extremely difficult to recreate in English the abundant rhymes, both assonant and consonant, that proliferate in Spanish and seem to be there for the taking. Not so in English. A poetic genius like Yeats makes rhyming seem a simple, natural matter, no more difficult than drawing breath, but for lesser mortals, moving from an easily rhymed language to one in which finding rhymes can best be described as arduous, is an excruciating process. Even more discouraging is the sad fact that more often than not, a translation that stresses the recreation of rhyme begins to resemble not the source poem, but doggerel plagiarized from a cheap greeting card. Then, too, lines can become drastically convoluted in a translator's desperate effort to create rhymes that convey the sense of the original. Consequently, as I have written elsewhere, experience has led me to concentrate on the rhythm of the poem and take my own the wisdom found in the Duke Ellington's tune, "It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing." Rhythm in a poem is in part function of the meter in which the piece is written. Spanish meter is determined by the number of syllables in a line. English meter, on the other hand, is based on the number of feet, that is, the clustering of a stressed syllable and its attendant unstressed syllables. English versification is different from the meters found in Romance languages, but even though they are dissimilar, it has always seemed important to me to try to recreate the syllable count of Spanish meter in the English language version of a poem, and, if possible, to place the stresses in the English line where they are found in the Spanish. Over the years, this has become a guiding principle when I translate metric poetry. The poems in this volume are no exception. Blank verse raises other issues, but they are irrelevant here since all of Sor Juana's poetry uses both rhyme and traditional meter. Turning the translation of Golden Age prose in general, I find it important to avoid fustian imitation of Elizabethan language and use contemporary English instead. Sor Juana wrote what was, for her, up-to-date, not archaic Spanish. I don't believe a translation acquires authenticity, accuracy, or artfulness if it is written in an invented 17th century idiom that is cumbersome for the translator to create, onerous for the reader to peruse, and not at all like the language used by the original author. Further, what Sor Juana has to say in her prose is so crucially important that I wanted nothing to interfere with your apprehension of it, and I certainly did not want to place any obstacles in the way of you being moved by it. My sincere wish is that your mind is nourished and your heart filled with what you read in this new translation, Selected Works by the 10th Muse of Mexico. So, shall we get into the poetry of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz as translated by Edith Grossman? I must say I did look up Edith Grossman, and Edith Grossman is an amazing translator. She's translated the works of Miguel de Cervantes, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, many classic literary works of Latin America. Sadly, Edith Grossman passed away on September 4th, 2023 at the age of 27 in New York City. She went to the University of Pennsylvania and for her bachelor's and master's degrees, and then she received her PhD from New York University. Let's get into the work of Sor Juana as translated by Edith Grossman. This collection is organized in ballads, redondillas, epigrams, décimas, sonnets, and then she has a play, the letter from Sor Filotea to Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, and a response to the poet, to the very eminent Sor Filotea de la Cruz. I am going to focus on the poetry for this video. So this is Ballad 2. Edith Grossman introduces as such. She acknowledges the the excesses of a good deal of erudition, which she fears is useless even to learning and injurious to living. This is the poem. Let us pretend I am happy. Melancholy thought for a while. Perhaps you can persuade me, though. I know the contrary is true. For since on mere apprehension they say all suffering depends, if you imagine good fortune, you will not be so downcast. Let my understanding at times allow me to rest awhile, and let my wits not always be opposed to my own advantage. All people have opinions and judgments so multitudinous, that when one states this is black, the other proves it is white. Some find attractive precisely what others deem an annoyance. An alleviation for one is bothersome for another. One who is sad criticizes the happy man as frivolous, and one who is happy derides the sad man and his suffering. The two philosophers of Greece offered perfect proofs of this truth, for what costs laughter in one man occasioned tears in the other. The contradiction has been famed for centuries beyond number, yet which of the two was correct has so far not been determined. Instead, into their two factions all people have been recruited, temperament dictating which band each person will adhere to. One says that the inconstant world is worthy only of laughter, another that its misfortunes are only to be lamented. A proof is found for everything, a reason on which to base it, and nothing has a good reason, since there is reason for so much. All people are equal judges, being both equal and varied. There is no one who can decide which argument is true and right. Since no one can adjudicate, why do you think mistakenly that God entrusted you alone with the decision in this case? Oh, why inhuman and severe, and acting against yourself in the choice between bitter and sweet, do you wish to choose the bitter? If my understanding is my own, why must I always find it so slow and dull about relief? So sharp and keen about distress. Discursive reason is a sword, quite effective at both ends. With the point of the blade it kills, the pommel on the hilt protects. If you, aware of the danger, wish to wield the point of the sword, how can the steel blade be to blame for the evil acts of your hand? Knowing how to create subtle, specious reasons is not knowledge. True knowledge consists only in choosing salutary virtue. Scrutinizing all misfortunes and examining bad omens achieves nothing but the growth of the bad through anticipation. In future deliberations, our attention, grown more subtle, will imagine threatened attacks as more alarming than the risks. How blithesome is the ignorance of one who, unlearned but wise, deems his affliction, his nescience, all he does not know, as sacred. The most daring flights of genius do not always soar assured when they seek a throne in the fire and find a grave in copious tears. For knowledge is also a vice if it is not constantly curbed, and if this is not acknowledged, the greater the havoc it wreaks. And if the flight is not brought down, fed and fattened on subtleties, it will forget the essential, for the sake of the rare and strange. If a skilled hand does not prevent the growth of a thickly leafed tree, its proliferating branches will steal the substance of the fruit. If the bulk of ballast does not impede the speed of a swift ship, that flight creates the headlong fall from a most precipitous height. It is futile amenity. What does the flowering field care if autumn finds no fruit as long as May can display its blossoms? What benefit to intellect to gestate so many offspring if that multitude is followed by ill-fated miscarriages? And perforce this great misfortune must be followed by mischance. The one who gestates will be left, if not dead, then gravely injured. Our intellect is like fire, deeply ungrateful to matter. Flame consumes more matter, the brighter the fire appears. So rebellious a vassal to its own legitimate lord that the fire transforms the weapons of its defense into offenses. This appalling, daunting practice, this harsh and onerous toil, God gave to the children of men for the sake of their discipline. What mad ambition carries us, having forgotten who we are? If we live for so short a time, why do we wish to know so much? Oh, if there were only a school or seminary where they taught classes in how not to know as they teach classes in knowing. How happily the man would live who with languid circumspection would simply laugh at the menace of the influence of the stars. Let us learn about not knowing, O thought, for we then discover that for all I add to discourse, I usurp as much from my years. And that's the end of the poem. That was the ballad. So the ballad, I forgot to mention, Edith Grossman writes an explanation. A ballad called romances in Spanish are composed of an indefinite number of stanzas of generally octosyllabic lines. The odd lines rhyme unrhymed, the even lines using assonant rhyme. Next in the collection is the redondillas, and a redondilla is a stanza of 4 octosyllabic lines, usually rhymed AB, AB. And this one is one of my favorite lines, has one of my favorite lines of Sor Juana's writing. It's one of the lines she's famous for. And this is Redondilla 92. Edith Grossman introduces the poem with this. She proves the inconsistency in the pleasure and censure of men who accuse women of what they themselves cause. O foolish men who accuse. Okay, she was a woman ahead of her time that she could say the phrase, O foolish men. O foolish men who accuse women with so little cause, not seeing you are the reason for the very thing you blame. For if with unequaled longing you solicit their disdain, why wish them to behave well when you urge them on to evil? You contend with their resistance, then say gravely that the conquest arose from their licentiousness and not your extreme diligence. The audacity of your mad belief resembles that of the child who devises a monster and then afterward fears it. With foolish presumption you wish to find the woman you seek for your mistress Athais and Lucretia for your wife, whose caprice can be stranger than the man who ignores good counsel, clouts the looking-glass himself, then complains it is not clear. You occupy the same whether favored or disdained, complaining if women are cruel and mocking them if they love. You think highly of no woman, no matter how modest. If she rejects you, she is ungrateful, and if she accepts, unchaste. Always foolish in your actions with a measure that is uneven, you condemned one for being cruel, another for being easy. Then how can the woman you woo be temperate toward your courting? Ungrateful she offends you, and if easy she angers. But between anger and sorrow the object of your caprice may be one who does not love you, and then you may truly complain. To their sorrow your lovers give wings, to restraints they fly away, and after you make them sinful you wish they were filled with virtue. Who carries the greater guilt in a passion gone astray, the woman beseeched who false, or the man who begged her to yield? Or which one merits more blame, although both deserve our censure, the woman who sins for pay, or the man who pays to sin? But why are you so alarmed by the guilt you plainly deserve? Love them for what you make them, or make them what you can love. Cease your incessant entreaties, and then with justification you can accuse the affection of the one who solicits you. But I conclude your audacity does battle with countless weapons, for in promises and pleading you join world and flesh and devil. The epigram. I'm going to be reading epigram 94. in which she discovers the honorable lineage of a highborn drunkard. So that your blood may be known, you tell everyone, Alfeo, you come from kings. I believe you are of a very fine stock, and that you anger all you meet with your talk about those kings, who more than the kings of swords must have been the kings of cups. Sor Juana had such a wit in her writing, and that's something that I really enjoy. This is Decima 107. She comments in verse on the excuses of one who refused to speak in prose. The offense of being silent you have attempted to excuse, and you are much more convincing in the things that you have said. I have weighed and judged the offense by your own clear declaration, for one who speaks with this kind of discretion quite clearly shows that being silent was merely a desire, not necessity. When you excuse with discretion the reason you remain silent, you remind me of the loss of all that you fail to say. You increase for me the sorrow I felt on the day I saw you, because then I could not hear you, for proceeding with that silence, I could neither weigh nor judge the very thing I had lost. And we go back to contemplating that silence, the silence and the things we don't say in her writing, the things that are left for the reader to interpret. And finally, a sonnet. I'm going to read Sonnet 164, in which she responds to jealous suspicion with the rhetoric of weeping. This afternoon, my love, when I spoke to you, I could see in your face, in what you did, that you were not persuaded by mere words, and I wished you could see into my heart. And love, assisting me in my attempt, overcame the seeming impossible. For among the tears that my sorrow shed was my breaking heart, liquid and distilled. Enough of anger now, my love, enough. Do not let tyrant jealousy torment you, nor base suspicion roil your serenity. With foolish spectres and deceptive clues, in liquid humor, you have seen and touched my broken heart and held it in your hands. And the reference that she made here, and love assisting me in my attempt, is the reference. This reference is to the classical god of love. And then the second footnote here points out the phrase with foolish specters and deceptive clues and liquid humor. Humor here refers to a bodily fluid. That's interesting. That poem almost reminds me of like a Dali, a Salvador Dali work of art. That's, I kind of see like the fluid, the time melting away. So anyway, that's the poetry. Then we get into the rest of it, it's the prose, but I just wanted to focus on the poetry for this video. Now I want to talk about other works that Edith Grossman was able to translate in her lifetime that I'm really excited about, that I have on my TBR. And so I wanted to share one with you. I think where I go next, I've been thinking a lot about when I read something by a translator or by an author, and I'm looking at going into their catalog and looking for my next, maybe the next read on the horizon. In looking at Edith Grossman's translations, I'm thinking about how more can I explore the translations, the work, the art of Edith Grossman. So I did a little bit of a search, and I settled on one that I am really, really interested in, and I'll post the photo of the cover here. But my next, like where I'm going to go to next in the work of Edith Grossman, is um, the short novel Nada, a novel um, by Carmen Laforet, and it's translated by Edith Grossman. So check this out. Let's see if any of you have read this one or have this one on your horizon as well. I'm curious. It's published by Modern Library in English, and this is the publisher summary. Renowned as Spain's The Catcher in the Rye, this passionate coming-of-age novel follows a rebellious college-age girl as she uncovers her family's secrets in chaotic, polarized post-Civil War Barcelona. Ah, I'm so here for it. The Catcher in the Rye. So I've been meaning to reread The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, and it would be cool to read that alongside another like Catcher in the Rye-esque novel just to see the parallels. So it's Catcher in the Rye-esque. It's a coming of age novel, a rebellious college age girl, and family secrets, and Barcelona, post Civil War Barcelona. All of that interests me. This is the summary. Andrea, an 18-year-old orphan, moves in with her volatile Barcelona relatives to attend the local university. Living in genteel squalor in a mysterious house on Calle de Aribao, Andrea relies on her wealthy, beautiful bohemian friend Enna to prove that normal life exists beyond the Gothic dwelling she calls home. In 1 year, as her innocence melts away, Andrea learns the truth about her overbearing and religious aunt Angustias, her cruelly sensual, musically gifted uncle Roman, and his violent brother Juan, and her lovely aunt Gloria, who provides the family's bread with furtive gambling expeditions. She also learns the truth about Enna and why her friendship goes hand in hand with her interest in Andrea's family. Peppered with dark humor, energy, and hope, Carmen Laforet's stunning classic is the story of a young woman who endures the harsh realities of post-Civil War Barcelona, emerging wiser and stronger, and with a bright future ahead of her. So yeah, that's one that I'm interested in. Nada by Carmen Laforet, translated by Edith Grossman. And that is all. Thank you so much for watching. I am back to my household chores. Hasta la próxima.